The backyard smelled like expensive champagne and cut roses. I stood at the edge of my Aunt Victoria's garden party, watching her work the crowd like a conductor leading an orchestra. Every gesture calculated, every laugh precisely timed. She was 63 now, still striking, still terrifying in ways she'd perfected over 2 decades. "Celine, darling." She glided toward me, her hand extended like a benediction. "Still flying solo, I see. How brave." At 32, most women would feel the pressure. The crowd around us stilled. I felt it then, that familiar sting, the one I'd learned to hide behind a smile. "Actually," I said quietly, "I prefer my own company." Her laugh was a weapon. "Of course you do, sweetheart. That's what people say when they have no other options." My mother looked away. My sister suddenly found her drink fascinating. The dozen guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. I'd learned long ago that Victoria's cruelty was always wrapped in honey, making it nearly impossible for anyone to intervene without seeming rude. That was the pattern of my life. Victoria hadn't always been this way. Or rather, she had always been this way. I just hadn't always understood it. My childhood memories were like old photographs, each one framed with her voice. At my high school graduation, while my parents hugged me, Victoria mentioned how impressive it was that I'd finally achieved something. At my college acceptance, she congratulated me while simultaneously asking why I'd chosen such a modest school. Every accomplishment was filtered through her particular brand of backhanded praise. Every failure was a referendum on my character. But something shifted 5 years ago. That's when I met Peter. He was an afterthought at first. Just the quiet man married to the woman who'd convinced our family that I was the problem. Too sensitive, too ambitious, too desperate to be liked. He barely spoke at family dinners, content to let Victoria fill every silence with her opinions and observations about everyone's shortcomings. Then one evening, while Victoria was in the powder room, Peter asked me about my design work, a passion project I'd been developing for 3 years, something I'd never mentioned to the family because I knew what Victoria would say. He actually listened. He asked follow-up questions. He said, "That sounds brilliant, Celine. Why haven't you pursued it professionally?" I remember my chest tightening. "Because I work in marketing. It's stable." He nodded thoughtfully. "Stability is important, but so is joy." When Victoria returned, Peter went back to being the quiet backdrop to her story, but something had cracked open inside me. Over the next year, I began noticing things I'd been too hurt to see before. Peter would flinch when Victoria spoke in that particular tone, the one she used with waiters, shop assistants, and anyone she deemed beneath her social position. His shoulders would tense during her cutting remarks about his career, his family, his weight. Once, I watched her publicly correct him at a cousin's wedding, mocking his use of the word epitome in front of 30 people. He laughed it off, but I saw the way his hand shook as he lifted his glass. Then came the night everything fractured. I had stayed late after a family dinner to help my mother with dishes. Through the kitchen window, I could hear Victoria and Peter arguing in the living room. "You're worthless." Victoria's voice was ice. "Without me, you'd still be living in that pathetic apartment with your sad little teaching job. I made you." I was happier then. Peter's reply was barely audible. "I was myself." "Yourself? You were nothing. You still are. You're only tolerable because I've spent 20 years polishing your rough edges. Don't ever forget that." I stood frozen, soap suds dripping from my hands. When Peter emerged moments later, his eyes were red. He barely acknowledged me, but something shifted between us that night, an understanding. He saw that I understood. 3 months later, Peter called me. "We need to talk," he said. "Not at the house. Somewhere private." We met at a coffee shop across town. He looked diminished somehow, like he'd been slowly folding into himself. He ordered tea, but didn't drink it. "I'm leaving her," he said without preamble. "Next week." I've already found an apartment, opened a separate bank account. I'm done. I didn't know what to say. Victoria would spin this. She'd make herself the victim, paint him as ungrateful, rebuild her narrative within hours. There's more. Peter pulled a folder from his bag, sliding it across the table. I think you should see this. Inside were copies of emails, bank statements, photographs, and documents I never expected to exist. Evidence of affairs, multiple, deliberate, conducted with the same calculated precision she applied to everything else. Financial records showing how she'd systematically isolated Peter from their joint accounts. Emails between her and a therapist she'd consulted, discussing strategies for maintaining control in the relationship. Screenshots of messages to her children, coaching them to exclude their father from decisions, to view him as incompetent. But there was more, so much more. Documents showing how she'd manipulated family money over decades, ensuring her children inherited more than anyone else. Emails to my cousins, subtly undermining my credibility for projects we'd worked on together, inserting herself into situations where she could take credit. Photographs of her with a married man named Marcus, not from this year, but from 15 years ago during my uncle's illness. Why are you giving me this? I asked, though I already knew. Because she's been giving you the scraps her whole life, Peter said quietly. And I think you deserve to know the full picture. Not to hurt her. Not even for revenge. But for yourself. So you can stop believing that what she says about you has any truth in it. I held the folder, feeling the weight of it, literally and metaphorically. What will you do? I asked. Start over. Be honest with my therapist about what I've endured. Maybe help my children understand their mother isn't the person they think she is. Live simply, quietly. He paused. What will you do? I didn't answer then. I wasn't ready. For 6 months, I did nothing with the documents. Instead, I began building something else entirely. I left my marketing job and quietly launched a design consultancy for my apartment. It was small at first, 1 client, then 2, then 5. I worked from a coffee shop most mornings, my laptop my only companion. The work was fulfilling in a way I'd never experienced before. Each project was mine entirely, no one to diminish my efforts, no voice whispering that I'd gotten lucky. My design started getting noticed. A local magazine featured my work, then a regional one, then a design blog with a significant following. Within 8 months, my business had grown enough that I could work with carefully selected clients, companies that aligned with my values, aesthetics I believed in. I also did something else quietly. I started documenting Victoria's behavior, not obsessively, but carefully. Every pointed comment at family gatherings I noted. Every instance of her taking credit for someone else's work. Every moment I witnessed her gaslight Peter, before he finally left, my parents, my cousins. I created a private blog, not to expose her, but to process my experiences. I wrote about the psychology of emotional manipulation, about the long-term effects of being made to feel invisible in your own family, about the slow work of rebuilding self-worth when someone you're supposed to trust has spent years dismantling it. To my surprise, the blog found readers, people who recognized their own stories in mine, who felt less alone, who, in the comments section, shared their own experiences of familial cruelty, workplace betrayal, the slow erosion of confidence. The blog became my therapy and my secret rebellion. Victoria, of course, noticed none of it. She was too busy playing the victim after Peter's departure, spinning a narrative about his mental breakdown and her sacrifice in trying to help him. She never mentioned the infidelity, the financial manipulation, the systematic emotional abuse. In her version, she was simply a woman betrayed by an ungrateful man. The crisis came at her milestone birthday, a lavish celebration at an upscale restaurant. 300 guests invited to witness her continued reign. My mother asked me to attend. Please, Celine. For me. I almost declined, but something had shifted in me over the past year. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply clear. I arrived late, which was intentional. The room was already crowded, full of family and friends and business associates. People whose perception of Victoria had been shaped entirely by her curated presentation of herself. She stood at the center of it all, resplendent in a white dress, accepting congratulations like royalty. She saw me and smiled, the smile she reserved for public moments, warm and inclusive and entirely false. "Celine, I'm so glad you came. I was beginning to wonder if you were boycotting your dear aunt." She laughed, and the nearby guests laughed with her as if on cue. I moved closer, not threateningly but with purpose. "Actually," I said, loud enough to be heard by those nearby, "I came because there's something important you should all know about Victoria. Something that might change how you see her." The room tilted slightly. People turned toward us. Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment, a crack in the facade. "Celine, this really isn't the time." "I think it's the perfect time," I said. "With everyone here, I'd like to talk about the real Victoria. Not the version she spent 63 years perfecting, but the actual woman." My heart was hammering, but my voice was steady. I had practiced this moment for months, not the revenge version, but the truth version. The version that wasn't about destroying her, but about being heard. Victoria has built a reputation as someone to admire, successful, sophisticated, wise in the ways of family management. I began. But I think it's important for everyone to understand the cost of that image. The cost to Peter, who left her after 20 years because he couldn't endure her emotional abuse anymore. The cost to her children, who've been systematically groomed to believe that controlling others is a sign of strength. The cost to everyone in this family who's learned to hide pieces of themselves because they're afraid of Victoria's judgment. People were staring. My aunt's face had gone pale. "I'm not here to humiliate you," I said, looking directly at her. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I spent 32 years believing I was the problem, that your constant criticism meant something was actually wrong with me. And I think other people in this room might benefit from knowing that the problem isn't them. It's never been them. It's been you and the way you've used emotional cruelty to maintain power." I saw recognition dawn on several faces. My cousin Marcus, who Victoria had spent years implying wasn't smart enough for his career. My uncle, who'd endured decades of her contempt. A woman I didn't recognize who was watching with tears in her eyes. Probably a friend of Victoria's who'd been on the receiving end of her particular brand of manipulation. "The evidence is there if anyone wants to see it," I said quietly. "Peter has it. I have it. It documents years of infidelity, financial manipulation, and systematic emotional abuse. But more importantly, it shows a pattern, a deliberate choice to build yourself up by tearing others down." Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see her mind working, trying to find the right spin, the right way to reframe this. But there was nothing to reframe. The truth doesn't need a narrative. It simply exists. "I'm done being invisible," I said. "And I think after tonight, so is everyone else." What happened next wasn't dramatic or cathartic in the way people might imagine. Victoria didn't collapse. She didn't scream or cry or have a grand emotional breakdown. Instead, she simply deflated, like someone who'd been slowly leaking air finally ran out. She sat down at the nearest chair, and people moved away from her, not in a theatrical gesture, but in a natural, organic way. She'd been exposed, and without the shield of public approval. She was just a lonely woman who'd spent her whole life pushing people away. Her children looked at her with confusion and hurt. Some guests left quietly. Others stayed, talking in hushed tones, reassessing memories they'd been given new context for. I didn't stay for the rest of the evening. I walked out into the night air, and for the first time in decades I felt light. Not happy exactly, not triumphant, but free. 6 months later, Victoria suffered a stroke. It wasn't severe, but it required recovery time. She'd have to learn to walk again, to regain some of the mobility she'd lost. I sent flowers to the hospital, simple white lilies, nothing more. Peter, who'd rebuilt his life in quiet dignity, called to tell me he'd offered to help with her rehabilitation, not out of obligation or leftover love, but out of something quieter, compassion. He was giving Victoria something she'd never given anyone else, a second chance to be better. I don't know if she took it. I'd learned not to invest myself in her journey toward redemption. What I did know was that my own journey had fundamentally shifted. My design business had grown into something I never imagined. A team of 4 designers, a waiting list of clients, recognition in industry publications. More importantly, I'd reclaimed the parts of myself that Victoria had spent decades trying to convince me were worthless. I started dating again, not desperately but genuinely. Spent time with friends who chose me for who I actually was, not who I was trying to be. Wrote a book about rebuilding self-worth after familial trauma, which resonated with more people than I'd ever expected. And I stopped needing Victoria's approval or her disapproval or any acknowledgement from her at all. That, I realized, was the real victory, not the public exposure, not the revelation of her secrets, not even the satisfaction of being proven right. The real victory was the quiet, unremarkable freedom of simply becoming the person I was meant to be, with or without anyone's permission. Years later, my mother told me that Victoria had changed, not dramatically, but noticeably. She was quieter, less cutting. She spent time with a therapist, working through the roots of her need to control. She'd apologized to her children, hesitantly and imperfectly, but she'd tried. I accepted this information without judgment. People could change, or they could stay the same. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility to manage her journey. What mattered was that I'd learned to manage my own. The invisible reckoning hadn't been about destroying Victoria. It had been about retrieving myself from the rubble of her cruelty and building something beautiful from the remains. It had been about understanding that the only revenge worth having is the one where you emerge unbroken on the other side. And that, I discovered, was worth everything. For 32 years, I believed my worth was determined by my aunt's judgment, my family seating chart, and who received the credit for my accomplishments. I learned that respect is non-negotiable, and it starts with respecting yourself. Silence became my weapon. Patience became my power, not because I was weak, but because I was strategic. I chose to build myself up instead of tearing her down, and that choice changed everything. If you're struggling with being gaslit into invisibility, know this. Your silence doesn't define your strength. Your survival does. Your boundaries aren't difficult, they're necessary. Your survival isn't just remarkable, it's revolutionary. The world told me I was too sensitive, too ambitious, too desperate to be liked. But I was actually too valuable to keep small. I stopped waiting for permission to matter, and I started writing my own ending. That's when everything shifted. That's when I became unstoppable. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about setting boundaries, reclaiming your power, and turning humiliation into triumph. Because the real revolution happens quietly when you decide that your voice, your dreams, and your existence matter. Your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting to be remembered.